True. Let's go to Comma Green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kamji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Chill drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kamji verse.
So I want to talk about today this recent genetic study that proves that the ancient Carthaginians were black. Now, many people may find this confusing due to the amount of propaganda displayed in the mainstream media. This is typically propaganda designed to rob black people, the larger African continent and the diaspora, of agency. And they're typically doing what Dr. Vanessa Davies calls the genetic version of the invading pharaonic race model. And the idea behind this is they want to try every single method, every single nook and cranny that they have in the book to be able to remove black people historically from North Africa. But if we are to examine classical sources, classical Greek sources that detail the fact that the Garamantes and the Ethiopians were indigenous to North Africa and rode, spoked chariots, we easily see that even in antiquity, the fathers of Western historiography, like Herodotus, right, detailed that black people were indigenous to North Africa. But these recent studies, Merez et al. Dealing with the Nurat man, the Old Kingdom mummy, Salem et al., dealing with the idea of the Sahara as a genetic barrier, they are in complete contrast to the recommendations by Dr. Shamar Kekeda when he cautioned using genetics, particularly population genetics, to impose certain narratives on the historical record. This is completely inaccurate. And he did this in his analysis of the Schunemann et al. Study, being it sex chromosome biased, solely looking at mtDNA signatures, solely examining populations that were immigrants and foreigners into the land, and not having a meticulous analysis when it comes to the incorporation of linguistics, archaeology, bioanthropology in the understanding of that ancient population. And we obviously know that, Shamar Kekeda and J.P. Gordina et al.'s pop-affiliator analysis showed that the 18th dynasty Armana mummies were predominantly infra-Saharan Africans. But let's move forward to this study by Ringbauer et al. That says the Punic people were genetically diverse with almost no Levantine ancestors, right? Now, there are many different issues with the study. But if we are to take it at face value, what they're saying is that the Punic population or the Carthaginian population was predominantly dominated by Sicilians and populations of the southern Aegean during the early Bronze Age. Now, those of y'all who are familiar with my channel, you understand that the ancient Europeans were not necessarily the same as modern Europeans. Many of them are classified as Eurafricans because of their tropically adapted line proportions, as well as the fact that they didn't have the gene that most modern Eurasians have associated with light skin. They would have been black. When you're talking about the so-called Cheddar Man of Britain, which many modern Britons descend from directly, this would be considered a black man, or at least a very, very dark man, right, with Africoid elements ancestrally. So when we're looking at Europeans, Mesolithic Europeans like Lebrana man, we can clearly see that Lebrana man had many of the phenotypes associated with infra-Saharan African populations, as well as the supra-Saharan African populations that migrated out. We are also able to observe different elements of E3b, right? Or E1b1b and E1b1a in many instances migrating outside of the African continent. we can see certain variants, certain local variants of this E haplotype in the southern Aegean. So we could clearly see that there is some African ancestry that arrived there. Another instance in the southern Aegean is when we look at, human leukocyte antigens and certain, autosomal analysis among modern Greek populations, we can see that they cluster close to the Amhara of Ethiopia, which is again another indication of infra-Saharan African ancestry. And this makes perfect sense, especially when we deal with the fact that Thales of Miletus, all the way down to Plato, all of the great, Greek scholars and authors, the founders of Western philosophy and the humanities, they all studied in ancient Kemet. And there was clearly an interaction between Super-Saharan Africa and Southern Europe during this time, right? Even if we look at Brace analysis of the so-called Anatolian farmers, which would have also been another component of the Sicilian, of the Southern Aegean. These people were, bioanthropologically closely linked to the Natufian population. And previous videos that we presented on this channel showed documented evidence that the Natufians craniofacially matched so-called Niger-Congo groups, your Mandes, your Malians, et cetera, et cetera. So this is obviously very, very fascinating stuff, because even if we are to examine the analysis of Shamarki Keita with regards to the Carthaginians, we can clearly see that the Carthaginians craniofacially and bioanthropologically cluster closely with ancient North African populations, right? So the idea that, the Carthaginians are not North Africans is obviously fraudulent. And the methodology of these scholars to try to prove this is something that we can completely dismiss, right? Because even when we look at other North African populations, like the Garamonte, right, we can clearly see linkages. We can clearly see that the Garamonte cluster closely to so-called Sahelian populations. And other analysis from scholars has clearly shown the remnants of, what we would consider modern Sahelian culture, modern Saharo-Sahelian culture of different groups of Black Africans, in the usage of lip plugs and certain appendages. We could clearly see that the Garamonte, another group of North Africans, are following this trend, right? So both the Garamonte and the Carthaginians, they would be the descendants of the Ibero-Maurusians. And the Ibero-Maurusians were a dark-skinned Africoid people, right? So however you want to slice it, the Carthaginians in this study clearly are linked to Africoid populations. But when we get into the methodology of the study itself, we could clearly see a variety of errors, right? So first off, they used a 1240 S&P array, which is biased in the direction of Eurasians. This is not necessarily a completely accurate, acceptable S&P array. There also had some uneven sampling and temporal coverage. The study sampled from a wide range of sites across the Mediterranean, but the distribution is uneven. Some regions, like Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, have more samples than others, and not all time periods are equally represented. Many sites have only a handful of individuals with sufficient genomic data. This limits the ability to draw robust conclusions about the local population structure. And some of the samples even came from old excavations like Villaricos and Palermo, which may lack precise contextual data or have been subject to curation-related degradation, right? There's some dating and chronological uncertainty. The Hallstatt plateau of 800 to 400 BCE and the later plateau from 400 to 200 BCE complicate precise dating, right? And there's an indirect dating via association. Some of the individuals were dated based on association with radiocarbon dated relatives or archaeological context rather than direct dating. There's a lot of low coverage genomes. 36 individuals had fewer than 20,000 S&Ps and were excluded from genome-wide analysis. Another 28 had insufficient data for certain analyses, reducing statistical power. right? Standard ancient DNA authentication methods were applied, but poor preservation in some samples, right? Only 4 of 39 petrous bones from TN1 at Akzi, for example, limits the conclusions. So the success rates for the DNA recovery varied significantly by site and microenvironment. And this is dry versus damp conditions in various Akzi tombs. The reference populations is a big deal. So they didn't use any African reference populations in their admixture and QPADM analysis, and we've spoken about this ad nauseum. The fact that they didn't use Takakori or any of the Kadruga samples, or even the New Neurat sample. They didn't use any ancient North African sample, which according to Shamar Takeda's analysis craniometrically, that is where the Carthaginians mostly cluster towards, right? That is where the Garamanti populations mostly cluster towards, these Saharo-Sahelian populations, right? So they didn't use any of that in their modeling assumption, and that's what's called working backwards from their conclusion, right? If you're not going to use, indigenous African populations as your model proxies, you're obviously going to get a European result, right? So there's no way also in the study that you could have a North African proxy from a single individual. The primary North African reference is one Iron Age individual from Kinkella, Algeria. This assumes this individual is representative of a very broad and diverse region like the Maghreb, right? Some individuals from the Punic sites date to the Roman period, and their genetic profiles may reflect later demographic shifts rather than Punic-era patterns, right? The study assumes that the individuals buried in the Punic necropolises are genetically Punic, but burial practice does not always reflect genetic ancestry. We went over the many different problems of the PCA, how you could use it to pretty much say anything. And again, within this, they ignored the possibility of the Carthaginians being clustered among axes, a super-Saharan to infra-Saharan axes, a Happy River Basin to Jaliba River Basin axes, or something of the like. They completely ignored that, right? So again, we can understand that whether we're looking at the Garamantes, whom Roger Blench, linked more closely to so-called Nilo-Saharan, like Songhai Teta languages, rather than, so-called Afro-Asiatic, like Amazigh languages, whether we're talking about just the different evidences that, these populations were clustering close to infra-Saharan Africans, right? The numerous studies, showing that they have this type of affinity, Power-Ital study in particular, discussing that. Mattingly's study, just dealing with the fact that the bioanthropological data of the Garamantes clusters closely to so-called Malian populations. The idea that the Natufians, the study proving that the Natufians craniofacially are linked to Niger-Congo, like Bantu populations, so-called Mande populations, etc., etc. It's clear that from a bioanthropological perspective, the Carthaginians were more closely linked to Black Africa, and a genetic perspective, even if we take, what this study from Ringbauer et al. Is saying at face value, despite all of the different methodological flaws and limitations, low coverage data, etc. What they would be essentially saying is that the Carthaginians are descendant from a Euro-African population, largely affinities of African populations who migrated out of Africa, rested in Europe, and then migrated back south into the north. So however you slice it, all of these studies, all of these analyses prove that the Carthaginians are Black. That's all I got for y'all on this. I hope to catch you on the next one. Peace.
Today we are joined once again by Dr. Rebecca Futo-Kennedy. While surfing a bunch of my platforms that I'm present on as the study of antiquity in the Middle Ages, I've noticed a debate spark up again that I've seen off and on since my childhood, and that was whether or not Hannibal Barca was Black. And you see arguments about the Phoenician lineages, and people are going to bring up Berbers, but it's this, I've noticed this attempt to differentiate North Africa from the rest of it. And when I say from the rest of it, it's attempting to erase the Black history of North Africa away to a point as if like they were never up there to begin with already. And so this is my question. Was Hannibal, the man who made Rome tremble, Black?
As with any other question about this, right? First, let's call the thing what it is. This obsession with trying to make sure that this great general Hannibal, the man who makes Rome tremble, is a white man, is of course the desire is strong. And we can go back to Dodge and sort of like the Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, right? Because he classifies Hannibal as one of the sort of great generals. We have to claim him. But also I think going back to this tension that I already talked about with the issue of sub-Saharan, and what we mean by that sort of classification is this desire also to for people who lay claim to descents from in North Africa that are anti-Black as part of the sort of history of the development of the continent of Africa and the sort of Arab invasion and modern imperialism. There's a strong tendency to want to make sure we separate that. So yes, okay, obviously we have the myth of Dido and the founding of Carthage from Phoenicia. We also have Phoenix, the sort of the initiator of the Phoenicians in North Africa, or even in Ethiopia, right? If we read Heliodorus's novel from the 3rd or 4th century CE, we don't know the exact date. He's got they tell the myth of Andromeda in that. And Andromeda, and of course we have 5th century bases of this. This is Phoenix, who's the father of Andromeda, who they're white, or they're represented as Phoenician, as not Black, but they're in a space that is filled with Black people. So, but the crux of the story of Heliodorus is that the king and queen of Ethiopia are Black, and they have a daughter though who comes out to have really white skin. I mean, she's called white because she's a woman, but she has really pale skin, and so the mother has to hide the birth of this child because she's afraid that people will think that she had the child out of wedlock. But in fact, what happened is, and here you're going to get a little bit of insight into ancient medical theories. There is a medical theory called imprinting, where if in the act of sex you are staring at something, that image can imprint onto the fetus. It's something about how they understood how the eye worked, the nature of how the eye worked. And so in the story, this Black Ethiopian king and queen of Ethiopia are procreating, and she stares at a painting on the wall of Andromeda. And so the pale skin of Andromeda imprints on the child. And the whole thing ends up happy. Everybody's fine. Look, mom and dad, it's really me. But in the meantime, she's kidnapped by pirates and raised by shepherds. And there's true love. It's sort of like the Princess Bride of the ancient world. It's a really great story. But what it tells us, though, is how very common this sort of idea of these mixed identities are in North Africa. That we have these stories that have people who are Black and people who are not Black interacting all the time. And there's a reality that they could in fact be related, and it's not a big deal. This is the world that Hannibal exists in, right? This is the world of the Nubians and the Cushites, of the Ethiopians and the kingdom of Aksum, of West African Ethiopians who are obviously Black, of the Garamantes who we don't know what they look like, of the people known as the Berbers, who also, again, this is not an actual ethnic category. It becomes one later because it can connect to the sort of linguistic categories, but it's actually up in the air what to be called a Berber actually means. And we have this sort of stew pot of Phoenicians who have settled in these places, but they've integrated and mixed with people who are already there. And as we can go back to our Herodotus, right? Black Africans are indigenous to North Africa. So we're going to have these mixed populations. Egyptians might have Black skin, might be Black Africans. And even if their skin tones are slightly different, we would still call them Black today. And so is Hannibal Black? Again, the question is really, can we make him white? Which is the one thing he's not. He could be lots of things. The one thing he isn't is white, because that's not a category that they would have recognized. And it isn't actually one that fits. But if you look at his bust, right, we have this bust that I'll share with Nick, again, that comes from Capua. It was found in Italy, this bust of Hannibal, because remember, of course, the Carthaginians controlled Spain, parts of Spain, they controlled parts of Italy, they controlled Sardinia and Sicily. If you go to Sicily, the history of Sicily is a sort of highly mixed African, Greek, indigenous, and Italian cultures. Even today, I think they're still not sure how Italian they are down there in Sicily, which I love about them. But this bust that they found in Italy of Hannibal, if you look at the bust, if we're going to say, oh, look at the physical features, he's not white. But what does that mean? Because none of them are white. Is he Phoenician? Is he Berber? Whatever that means. Is he African? He's African. That we can say that with certainty. He is African. What that means beyond that is anybody's guess, but it actually, he's not European. So that was one thing we can actually say for sure. My whole point is, look, it doesn't matter if he's black. We will never know, but it doesn't matter because he could be, but I know what he isn't, and he isn't European, and he isn't German, and he's not Nordic, and he's not Aryan. He's not your people.
True as gold, a comma green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kanji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Big drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kanji verse.